Hey everybody, welcome to Hand of the Day number 28. This hand was once again sent in by Piefer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and we are playing as cutoff versus small blind flat in a single raise pot. Now small blind is the same opponent that we were playing against in the previous hand, which is described as a good/average reg. Unfortunately we don't have any additional information, but we can still use some population reads from the stake that this hand was played to make our best decision. Now I'm not going to go over the hand in the video. If you guys haven't already read over it, feel free to pause the video and then read over it and then continue the video. But before we head into Solver to do a little bit of analysis, I just want to read some replies that we got from Hand of the Day. So JD writes that I find small blind flat spots super funky because you're often left a little guessing as to whether they're playing an equilibrium flat spot or a range closer to a big blind defend. I would take this one step further. I think a lot of people who are flatting small blind might be doing it a little bit too much with pocket pairs, might be a little bit imbalanced towards that side of things. This would definitely describe how I play exploitatively, and I will probably save that information for a separate video. But I think that there are a couple different scenarios, right? Our opponent can obviously flat something closer to equilibrium, they can be a little bit more pocket pair heavy, which I think happens a lot, and they can definitely have a range that's a little bit closer to a big blind defend. So it's pretty tough to range our opponents in this spot, which means that it's going to be harder for us to use solvers to kind of approximate our answer. The next point I want to bring up comes from Alex, and Alex writes, do we check enough times on the river and credibly represent value hands in our range? And I think this point is important to consider because it highlights that we might not necessarily always be thinking enough about our own perceived range. So most people said that they would bluff here, and I'm assuming a big reason why we think we should bluff here is because we expect our opponent to be somewhat capped, or at least more than they should be compared to equilibrium after they check on the river. But by the same token, our opponent is also probably assuming that we're quite capped ourselves when we check on the turn, or again, at least a little bit more compared to Nash. So with those two things said, let's go ahead, jump in Solver, and just see what we can do with the solution. Alright everybody, so this is the Nash solution for cutoff, and we're going to start with a flop just to see our general strategy. I have the sim set here to use two different bet sizes. If we want to use just one, that's totally more than fine. That's the way that I play. And if we use B25, you can see that it's a pretty big mistake for us to range bet. And so we're just playing a very basic strategy where we're betting a lot of our strong hands, like sets, two pairs, etc. I don't really need to go over this too much. Now on the turn, what's interesting is that if we decide to check, we don't really have too many flush draws in our range anymore. As you can see, a lot of our flush draws should be betting, and that's where a lot of our bluffs come from. So the main hands we're checking are going to be two pairs, a whole lot of top pair, and some under pairs, and just generally stuff like that. We're playing very polar on these turns, and that's going to be the case on these sorts of textures versus small blind. And so on the river, we're not going to have very many straights, or sets, or even flushes when the jack completes. And as a result, you can see that we are not overbetting very often on the river. We're only really overbetting with a few residual flushes that we decide to check, which is only like 1% of our range. And we're definitely doing that with some straights as well, and then a couple of various bluffs. Now, we're using a lot of different bet sizes on the river, but one big bet size that we're using is going to be around 40 to 75% of the pot. If you're looking at a sim with like a 60% bet size option, I think that's the most preferred one here. And the main hands that are using this bet size of around 60 to 70% of the pot are actually two pair, which are 18% of our range, but we certainly have a lot of ace-jack offsuit, jack-10, those sorts of hands which want to bet but aren't willing to bet super big versus that very tight small blind range. Now, to figure out if we want to bluff or not here, the only real thing that I would think about is just our opponent's response versus various different bet sizes. I don't think balance is important in this spot at all because small blind flats are generally quite rare, and then the bet check bet line is also somewhat rare. So let's go ahead and look at our opponent's response versus different bet sizes, starting with B150. As you can see, our opponent is calling around 35% of the time, and this is what the defense strategy looks like. They're always calling with their sets, their straights, some of their two pairs as well, and then they are going to be meeting the defense frequency by calling some of their weaker ace-x as well as some king-x right over here. Now, I don't know if I actually like bluffing for the size, just because of one of the 2 points that I mentioned at the start of the video. The point was from Alex, where Alex said that it's important for us to consider our own range. just because we do look quite capped when we decide to check on the turn. As I showed, we don't use this overbet size quite often here because we're betting a lot of our flush draws on the turn, and our opponent might expect us to get here with a weak range that wants to bluff quite often. But there's another point that ties into this calling range right over here, which I'll discuss at the end of this video. But first, let's take a look at our opponent's response versus B40. As you can see, they should be calling a lot more hands versus B40. Their Ace-X is almost always calling, they're calling a lot more King-X, and they're even calling hands like Queen-10, which are a very weak pair on this board. Even Pocket 9s is sometimes calling, and in the other sim that I looked at, the calling frequency of 9x was about 50%. Now let's tie this back to that other point that I mentioned. If you guys remember, at the start of the video I mentioned that it's pretty tough for us to range our opponent in the small blind flat call formation. So they might have a range that actually looks somewhat close to this, or they might have a slightly wider range, or quite likely they'll have a lot more missed pocket pairs in their range. So if our opponent happens to be calling a range that looks somewhat closer to that, then this bet size makes even more sense than B150. And that's because if our opponent has more pocket pairs here and they have less Ace-X, or even anything just remotely resembling a more condensed range, then our opponent would have to call more hands like Pocket 9s, which just feels like such a weak call versus B40. It's very, very unintuitive. Versus, if we use B150 and our opponent has this more condensed range, because this Ace-X is already folding at Nash, if we just remove some of these hands from our opponent's range and we give them some more pocket pairs, these pocket pairs will still overwhelmingly have to fold. So we're not really allowing our opponent to make such a big mistake when we're using B150. And so even if our opponent wants to bluff catch us versus this line because they think that our range is fairly capped here, they'll definitely have a much harder time doing this versus B40 just because the calls are already so unintuitive at Nash. And so that concludes the analysis. If you haven't already, feel free to join the Discord to participate in Hand of the Day and have your hands reviewed by myself and other motivated poker players. See you guys in the next one.